BBC America presents an encore performance of the last night of the Prom's 2001 concert that honored the victims of September 11th. Chief conductor Leonard Slatkin and the BBC Symphony Orchestra created a night of beauty, passion, and heart-driven music. Join BBC America as we broadcast this special tribute. Last night of the Proms, tonight, 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific, only on BBC America.
There was no concept in the minds of almost all Americans that the United States would be attacked by anybody. And yet here they were seeing it unfolding on television sets around the country. There was this shared sense of horror, of fear. People are wondering whether to evacuate. People are going to churches to pray, to hospitals to give blood. And there was this great outpouring not only of sympathy, but of immediate aid. It was a unifying moment in the nation, and yet people were uncertain what kind of conflict, what kind of year, what kind of days lay ahead.
I don't care if it upsets people what I say, I just don't want it to be unfair.
Being wrong is the biggest sin of them all. The more I've seen, the more it hurts.
I feel that it's a voice of reason and honesty in a world that doesn't have enough reason and honesty in it.
The best way out is by coming in. Going to family learning programs helps you and your family lead better lives. Call 1-877-FAMLIT-1.
We now return to BBC World News.
One year on, at Ground Zero in New York, people have come together to mourn the dead. At this site, thousands of people gathered to remember the 2,801 people who died here in New York City. At the Pentagon, President Bush talked about a day of prayers and a day of tears. And in rural Pennsylvania, the courage of those who overpowered the hijackers has been remembered. Hello and welcome to New York City, where behind me at Ground Zero, the final few names are being read. It's been the end of a somber ceremony to remember all those who died here in New York exactly 1 year ago. In an extremely windy New York City, people have come together from all over the country, but particularly, of course, from New York State. Families of those who died, members of the emergency services. And the names are being read of all those who died, some of those read just by family and friends, and also by people like the US Secretary of State, Colin Powell, and by the Senator for New York, Hillary Clinton. Well, of course, the focus has been here in New York, but also thousands of people have taken part in events across the world to remember those who died, not all of them, of course, American. The terrible events of September the 11th last year were marked by a minute's silence. That began at Ground Zero to mark the point at which the first plane hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center. That was then later followed by another moment of silence to remember those who died when the second tower was hit. In Washington, meanwhile, thousands of people gathered to remember those who lost their lives in the attack on the Pentagon. And in the tiny Pennsylvania town of Shanksville, a bell tolled for the 40 people who died when the fourth hijacked plane crashed into the countryside. Our correspondent Jane Stanley takes a look now at the events so far in the United States.
The day which no one has been looking forward to finally came. The relatives of the dead arrived early at Ground Zero, finding solace just being with each other where their loved ones died. Special places have been set aside for them on this sacred ground. The rescue and recovery workers came too, sharing comfort and community, supporting one another. Pipe and drum bands followed them into the site, deep down into the 16-acre hole in the heart of Manhattan. Their music enough to bring tears to any dry eye here. And then, at the exact time the first hijacked aeroplanes hit the first of the Twin Towers, America fell silent. 8:46 in the morning, and a nation united in prayer and reflection. In Pennsylvania, they paid tribute in the field where United Airlines Flight 93 came down. And in Washington, at the Pentagon, where 184 men and women died. And at the White House, a country and its leader had no words to express what they felt. At Ground Zero, the man who led New York through its most punishing hours made sure that every single victim was remembered.
Gordon M. Ahmad Jr. Edelmiro Abad. Maria Rose Abad.
Rudolph Giuliani, the former mayor, began the reading of the names of each of the 2,801 people who died when the Twin Towers fell.
Michael Asiak.
Thomas J. Ashton.
Janice Marie Ashley.
Family members who could bear the pain followed suit. Their relatives gone, but not forgotten.
Gerard P. Atwood.
The youngest was only 11, Brittany Clark, whose father Keith worked on the 96th floor.
This poem makes me feel like my daddy is speaking to me. I give you this one thought to keep. I am with you still. I do not sleep. I am...
For every family, there was the chance to go where they haven't been before, to the spot where the Twin Towers once stood. They laid flowers. For some, this was the funeral they can never have. No remains have been found for 2,000 of the victims. It is hallowed ground here. At 10:29 local time, the toll of the bell, marking the dreadful moment when the second tower fell. It should have marked the end of the commemoration service too, but there were so many names to read out, it had to continue. For the families, at least they had each other as they stood where their loved ones died. Jane Stanley, BBC News, New York.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Michelle Hussein, who joins me from that ceremony at the Pentagon. Michelle, I'm sure a ceremony that had its sober moments, of course, but quite interesting listening to the President and to the Secretary of State for Defense. Some quite tough rhetoric from them.
They spoke in very resolute terms, Jane, you're absolutely right. President Bush talking about the unending commitment to win the war on terrorism that he said, of course, started 1 year ago today. Donald Rumsfeld also speaking about how those who died here, the 184 people who died when the plane crashed into this western facade of the Pentagon behind me, that they would never be forgotten. This was a very emotional ceremony, though. Of the 12,000 people here at the Pentagon, about 10,000 of them actually work in the Pentagon. So, as you can imagine, many of them had lost friends and colleagues. Also here were the victims of those who died here at the western facade. So overall, a very, very emotional ceremony for all those present.
And the Pentagon, of course, the section that was hit, largely rebuilt. There seems to be a real sense of resilience among the people there.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, much was made here at the Pentagon about that reconstruction effort. It really did proceed at an amazing pace. It was called Operation Phoenix to try and rebuild the Pentagon from the ashes. And it really did proceed much faster than many people had expected. The outer ring of the Pentagon was completed about a month ago. And although this is still a construction site, there are people who still need to move back into offices. The facade, at least, is complete. In the western facade behind me, there is one stone left, which is the original blackened limestone from that day a year ago, and that's inscribed with the date September 11, 2001. But other than that, the entire facade has been renewed.
Michelle, for now, thank you very much. Well, a rather different ceremony took place in Shanksville in Pennsylvania, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, to commemorate those who died in the last of the 4 terrorist attacks. Of course, our correspondent Jackie Rowland is there for us. Jackie, talk us through exactly what happened where you are, a very small town.
Well, it might have been a smaller ceremony, but I have to say it was very somber and very dignified. We had an orchestra, we had military bands, there was a fly past of Hercules planes. There were also, the bell was tolled 40 times, and each of the 40 names was read for the members of the crew and the passengers who died when the plane crashed, just about half a mile behind me beyond the hilltops. Also a very moving speech by the man who's now in charge of Homeland Security for the United States, Tom Ridge. However, on the 11th of September last year, he was governor of Pennsylvania. And he made the point that while there may not have been any survivors here in the field near Shanksville, who knows how many hundreds or even thousands of people did survive what could have been another deadly terrorist attack in Washington if the 40 members of crew and passengers hadn't been able to bring the plane down. So he really emphasized again the life that had been spared as a result of the courageous actions of the people on board that plane.
Yes, and Jackie, sorry, it's extremely noisy and windy here, but I'm assuming you can hear me rather better than I can hear you. But an extraordinary event as well, I think, for the people of such a small town who've really been thrust into the limelight with this.
They have. I mean, this is a community of 245 people. No one had heard of Shanksville just over a year ago, but suddenly Shanksville came onto the map, and people hear their village named in the same sentence as New York and Washington when people are remembering the places that suffered as a result of the terrorist attacks. I have to say that when the speeches were being made here at the memorial service, the biggest applause was for the people of Shanksville, because the families of the victims of Flight 93 really feel that the people of Shanksville invited them into their homes, invited them into their hearts. And the people of this small community do feel that they have a very special responsibility to preserve and protect the crash site, and it's they who tend the
has been Evan Cornock. He's been here with the BBC throughout the day, watching all the commemorations. A former press advisor to the Mayor, Ed Koch, and teaches at Columbia University here in the city as well. Knows a great deal about the history of New York. Evan, thanks for staying with us here on the BBC. It's been an extraordinary morning. It's hard to take it all in, and it's hard to think now that it was all 1 year ago today.
Yeah, for me, the moment when 10:29, when they when all the sirens and foghorns went off to mark the fall of the second tower, I just felt a chill go up and down my spine, and remembering that day and in a sense experiencing it again. I think it's a very hard time, I think, for New Yorkers to think about in detail what that day was like and what the year has been like.
We've seen an extraordinary turnout here this morning. There's still an awful lot of people down at the site behind us, and even the weather is reminiscent, rather windier than it was, but a beautiful, warm day, bright blue skies. That makes it doubly hard, perhaps.
September's always a beautiful month in New York, and it always has this clarity you never find in any other month. And that day was so memorable that there was the beauty of the city and the clarity of the day, and yet the smoke rising as it did for days and weeks after that. And the wind and the dust swirling around the site down there brings a bit of that back. Fortunately, not with the same impact, but still, it reminds you of all that went on and all of the huge process of unbuilding the World Trade Center and carting away the tons of rubble and the recovery of the bodies, and all that has gone on.
And that in itself, such an incredibly long job, of course. And now we get into the debate about what should be done with that site, what should be done with the footprints as it's become known. What's your feeling about that as someone who lives and works here?
Well, I think, you balance the need to memorialize those who died and to recognize the event, and the need not to hamstring the redevelopment of this vital area of New York, Lower Manhattan, the traditional business district, Wall Street, the kind of home of American business. And it's not as important as it was 80 years ago as a financial center. There are more rivals, and more of those kinds of businesses have moved to Midtown Manhattan and so forth. But it's still an incredibly important part, and I think part of what New Yorkers tend to do is take adversity and find some way to either profit from it individually or to bring something to the city as a result of that. And I think that's what New Yorkers are looking at now. I think New Yorkers are very engaged in what's going to be on this site and how is it going to be used. But I think New Yorkers also want this part of the city to be vital again.
I have been struck since I arrived here with just the sheer resilience of New Yorkers. But the city, I guess particularly this part of Manhattan, is still suffering economically, though, as a result of September the 11th.
Yes, and there are many, you read articles or you talk to people who have businesses down here, and they're still suffering through various things, but a lot of it's coming back. There are incentives for businesses and also for residents who want to move to this neighborhood. And one of the great barometers of the health of New York is always real estate values. And there was definitely a dip after September 11th, particularly in this part of the city, but it's coming back very strong. And, that's one measure of the people's confidence in the city's ultimate revival and continuing to flourish.
Evan Cornog, for now, thanks very much as ever. Thanks for joining us here on the BBC. And of course, commemorations not just happening here in the United States. There's been a lot to remember in Britain as well. And we can go to our correspondent, Sue Littlemore, who's at the American Embassy in central London. Sue.
Thank you, Jane. Well, behind me, I don't know if you can see some of the people wearing leathers. They're the people, members of the Harley-Davidson owners group, and the 21 of them have decided to travel up from Hampshire today to bring letters of condolences here and to sign the books. They were here last year and they wanted to make the journey once again to come here. So many people have taken the trouble to come here to express their grief and their sorrow. Well, with me now is Debbie Kerslake from Cruz Bereavement Care. Now, Debbie, you were involved last year with the families, the bereaved families in New York. Tell me what your role was.
Right, well, Cruz Bereavement Care were approached by the Foreign Office to send out volunteers to go along there and be with the British families arriving in New York to provide bereavement support. So it was whatever support the families needed. And I was there for 3 weeks of that time.
Now, there were 67 British victims in the Twin Towers. What sort of support do you give to families in that situation?
It was very flexible according to what families needed. So sometimes it was they were arriving in a strange country, it was meeting them at the airport and being with them as they did things like lay flowers at a shrine, visit the family centre, look at photographs and write messages to their loved ones. And then we went along with families to Ground Zero, which was clearly a very traumatic event for people, but we were there alongside them.
What sort of stories did they share with you?
They shared the stories of the last phone calls, the last contact that they'd had, why their loved one was in the building, and all sorts of details about the relationship and what they'd lost, and the dreams and the hopes that they'd lost.
A year on, what sort of support does an organisation like yours continue to give to people?
We are still there for an organisation. People can come to us at whatever stage of bereavement, whether it's in the first few weeks, months, sometimes years, and people can come to us. We have a helpline, we have local branches, we have group support, and it's really looking at whatever the needs of the individual, whatever the needs are.
Presumably the sort of grief and the pain that you might feel 12 months on is different from what you feel 4 weeks on.
It is, but it's important that people know that there's an organisation that they can turn to and that will listen and will understand the pain and the grief that they're going through, no matter how long after the death it is.
Have you been contacted by people who are not directly involved?
Yes, we have. Our own helpline and the helpline set up after the disaster had a lot of calls from people where the sight of these scenes on television had triggered feelings about bereavements that they'd experienced, and it's important that we're there to support them as well.
Many thanks indeed, Debbie. Well, there's so many people coming here to express their grief, including a fireman who's just arrived from Cheshire, who is handing over a cheque for £60,000 for the New York firefighters, money that he has raised himself. Now back to Jane.
Sue, thank you very much. Back here in New York City, but meanwhile, let me just bring you some news that's just breaking in London. In fact, news that the British Parliament is going to be recalled. We're just hearing that now. Parliament, the next session of Parliament isn't due to begin until October, the traditional beginning of the autumn period of the British Parliament. But there had been pressure on Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, from some pressure from members of his own party, indeed, to recall Parliament to debate the issue of Iraq properly. Tony Blair, of course, very strong with George Bush, standing shoulder to shoulder on the issue of Iraq, the phrase we've heard so often. And there was some concern among some British politicians that British politicians weren't being consulted. There's a lot of disquiet among the British populace too. If you look at poll ratings, the majority of the British people don't believe that there should be a strike on Iraq. So we are just hearing from London now that clearly that pressure has been yielded to. The Parliament will be recalled. I don't know the exact date that it'll be recalled, but clearly it is going to go into session earlier than the planned date in October. That news just coming in from Westminster. Well, commemorations here and across the world, of course, to mark the first anniversary of the attacks of September the 11th, 2001. But of course, we know what came from that, what resulted from that, the war on terrorism, as George Bush swiftly called it, the attempt to flush Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. Let's discuss a few of those issues. I'm joined by the BBC security correspondent, Frank Gardner, who's with me here at Ground Zero. Frank, just touching even upon the fact that we hear that the British Parliament is going to be recalled, on the whole issue of Iraq, if we talk about that first of all, it does look as if we're edging closer and closer to something.
It really does. I mean, the speculation is that Tony Blair has already made up his mind to go to war with Iraq. He feels it's a sort of moral duty, even though it's extremely unpopular with many members of his own party, even possibly with members of the cabinet as well. There is a feeling amongst the intelligence community in Britain and the US that if they wait too much longer, then when they do eventually have to go to war with Iraq, as they feel it's inevitable, that Iraq will in some way be able to hold the West hostage by saying, okay, that's far enough. If you go further, we've got a device already buried inside London or New York, and we will set it off. That's their fear. That's the ultimate nightmare for them. We visited this already in early '98. I was in Kuwait at the time, and the fear there was that Iraqi agents might already have imported some kind of a biological agent or chemical agent in an aerosol form and be spraying it from a building. Of course, it never happened. And Iraq, it's important to say, says they don't have any weapons of mass destruction. But Britain, it seems, does seem to be embarking on this course. It's going to be very hard to stop it, I think, whatever Parliament decides.
Meanwhile, here in the United States, we're all on on heightened alert following warnings yesterday from John Ashcroft, the Attorney General. We're on the orange level. How long does that sustain? At what point does the administration decide things aren't quite as bad as perhaps they thought they were?
Well, this is exactly the problem, Jane. You put your finger on it. They can't sustain this level of security alert for very long. It was already proving quite difficult at the level below this, at yellow, and particularly the military level of alert that the US forces were on in the Gulf. It involves stopping people from going on leave. It involves stopping rotation. It has to call out, they've got to call out extra people. Ships are on extra security patrolling. It's not only costly, but a huge strain on morale. And of course, if nothing happens, then inevitably people's readiness tends to drop. And this is exactly what Al-Qaeda is waiting for. It's most unlikely that core central Al-Qaeda would strike while the US and the West is on full alert. Their tactic is to wait for the West to eventually say, okay, nothing's happened, we can relax a little bit. We're still on our guard, but we can relax. That's the point at which Al-Qaeda would most likely to strike, where the West is just dropping its guard.
And yet, is it fair to say that despite the warnings we heard yesterday, that they do believe, the administration does believe, that the threat is greatest to American targets outside this country?
Well, Al-Qaeda's prime target is the continental United States. They want a core prestige target, something like what they did in September last year, possibly the Statue of Liberty, a big nuclear power plant, the center of government in Washington. These are the targets they'd like to go for. But these have become very well defended, very hard targets for them to hit now. So the next most accessible thing for them is to hit at US interests abroad. And that's why we've had this alert in the last 24 hours, based on information coming from an informant, that a truck bomber or several would try to target US embassies in the Far East. And that's why Britain has put its own embassies on alert there as well.
Okay, Frank, for now, thanks very much indeed, Frank Gardner. Well, despite the security fears and the issues that Frank was talking about there, today's ceremonies here in the United States have nonetheless continued completely as planned, as scheduled. We saw President Bush and the Secretary of State Donald Rumsfeld at the ceremony at the Pentagon. And meanwhile, here in New York City, here at Ground Zero, we can see that the ceremony is continuing. It has clearly overrun. The official end of the ceremony was marked at 10:29 in the morning New York time. That's, of course, the time that the second tower fell, the North Tower fell. Here in New York, 2,801 people died, of course, in that terrorist attack. And today, the nation has been marking that day. We've heard many tales of resilience, even here on BBC News. People saying that New York will move on, that it will recover.
Well, you're watching BBC World. I'm Kaishanina Bratnam. Now for some other news outside the United States. The Palestinian cabinet has resigned to avoid a vote of no confidence. Ministers submitted their resignation to Yasser Arafat just moments before Parliament was due to vote on the cabinet. Legislators had indicated that the meeting they would reject the cabinet. The vote was then cancelled. The resignation comes shortly after Ms Arafat announced that the forthcoming general elections would be held on the 20th of January. Well, speaking to journalists after the resignation, Minister and senior negotiator Saeb Erekat said that the cabinet's decision was in the interest of the Palestinian people.
The ministers consulted each other and decided, for the benefit of the Palestinian people and to the difficult circumstances our people are facing, to submit our resignations to President Arafat in order to enable him to form a new cabinet and to be able to submit it to the council in accordance with the basic law. President Arafat accepted the resignation, and I hope that today will be viewed as a landmark in Palestinian people's history, Palestinian people's development. The reflection today should demonstrate that the Palestinian development is going through a natural process. Palestinian people have chosen democracy, have chosen accountability, have chosen transparency, have chosen the will and to accept the will of the representatives of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian people.
Saeed Barakat. In the Gaza Strip, Israeli troops have moved into 2 Palestinian towns. The Israeli forces, which included more than 20 tanks and bulldozers, took control of the town of Beit Lahia and part of Beit Hanun. There was some gunfire, but no casualties were reported. In Indian-controlled Kashmir, police say that suspected Islamic militants have shot dead a state minister at a rally ahead of next week's state elections. Police said that Jammu Kashmir State Law Minister Mushtaq Ahmed Lone and at least 4 supporters were killed in Kupwara district north of Srinagar. In a separate incident, police say that 7 people, including a 12-year-old girl, were shot dead at a bus stand in Poonch district in the south of the state. Police in Pakistan have killed 2 people and arrested at least 5 others during a siege on a building in the southern city of Karachi. Intelligence agents began the operation but had to call in reinforcements after they came under attack. Pakistani police then surrounded the building. The gun battle continued for several hours before the gunmen inside surrendered. A young child was also killed in the shootout and 6 policemen were wounded. Pakistani officials say that they don't know who the gunmen are or what they're seeking. In India, the death toll from Tuesday's express train crash has risen to 88. A special train was laid on to take injured survivors from the crash site in Bihar to Delhi. Relatives and media crowded the station for the train's arrival. Officials say that the death toll is expected to rise further. Huge crowds at the site are hindering the work as relatives search for survivors. Well, coming up next, your chance to have your say about September the 11th. Nick Gowing will be taking your calls and emails about how lives have changed since the attacks 1 year ago. Email us at september11@bbc.co.uk or call us on 44 20 87 49 53 53. We'll call you back. This is BBC World. That's all from the newsroom for the moment. Thanks very much for watching.
BBC America presents an encore performance of the last night of the Proms 2001 concert that honored the victims of September 11th. Chief conductor Leonard Slatkin and the BBC Symphony Orchestra created a night of beauty, passion, and heart-driven music. Join BBC America as we broadcast this special tribute. Last night of the Proms, tonight, 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific, only on BBC America.
I heard a low rumbling sound, and everything went completely black. We stumbled through the dust into this stage door deli. Everybody was covered in dust, just in shock. There was a young woman in there, and she was petrified. She had been inside the towers and had managed to get out before the buildings came down, and she was calling her parents, and she was crying to them on the phone, just saying, "Mommy, Daddy, I want to come home. I love you." People stumbled in here. There was an old man who stumbled in, and he had also come down at least 70 flights, and he smiled because he knew that he had survived, and he was happy to be alive.
Oh, let's sit down for a second, please. There's Mary from your class.
Hi, Mary. Hi, Kayla. Come and play.
Oh, sweetie. Sweetie. Why don't you go play with those kids over there?
Why?
Imagine the power of one voice. Find yours at freedomcenter.org.
I don't know a single journalist worth their salt who hasn't been upset by violence.
We're just not in the business of throwing nastiness in the faces of people merely for impact.
One didn't know who was innocent, one didn't know who was guilty, one didn't know who was right, one didn't know who was wrong.
I'd never seen anything that affected me quite so much as that.
Tell the world, they said to us.
Wars are seedy, dirty, nasty things, but they have to be covered as much as anything else does.
Everybody in Oman knew where they were and what they were doing when that bomb went off.
There's always somebody who makes you realize that whatever problems that we've got personally, their problems are much worse and they're getting over them.
I'm amazed by the amount of good human nature that exists in dreadful circumstances.
Kids, here's my favorite animal. Strong, intelligent, ethical, dependable, compassionate, and patriotic. By the way, where's John?
Intelligent, strong, ethical, dependable, compassionate, and patriotic.
When you help your neighbors, you help your nation. Everyone can do something.
Visit us at usafreedomcorps.gov.
When I was senator, I did a lot
After that, I was able to orbit the Earth in a great big rocket ship.
We now return to BBC World News.
Welcome from me, Nick Gowing. There are a multitude of views about what happened a year ago, what's happened since, why, the root causes. In these 4 interactive programs over the 9 hours up until 2100 GMT, we want to hear as many views as possible from people like you out there right around the world. In this half hour, how people's lives have changed. Here in London, Dr. Michael Isaac, who is a psychiatrist and expert on post-traumatic stress from the Maudsley Hospital here in London. You can contact us in various ways over the next half hour and the coming hours. Here are the details. By phone, 4420-8749, 5353. We'll call you straight back. 447736 100 100. That's the text message number. Please, though, include your name, otherwise we won't get in touch with you. And by email, september11@bbc.co.uk. And our coverage is on BBC World, BBC News 24, and BBC Online. That's bbc.co.uk/September the 11th. Well, let's now move on immediately to California in the United States, to John Clayton. And John Clayton, your concern is about vulnerability.
Well, I think as a Brit living in Southern California, it's given me a rather unique perspective. Before, Americans all thought it was over there, and now suddenly it's over here. And I think for the first time in Americans' lives, they really felt a personal sense of vulnerability. But you know what? I think there was a side benefit to all this. I think it made people realize what is really important in my life, my friends, my family, my loved ones. And I think that's a very important aspect of all this.
Well, that's very much reflected, John, in an email we've had from Ina Tiso from the United States, who said, this fundamental shock to our world has made us, the survivors, re-examine who and what we are and helped us realize how little we really know of all the things around us. John Clayton, what about that vulnerability? How much do you feel that where you are?
I think it's given me, the fact is, you know, I grew up in London during World War II. I was only a very small kid, but I do remember the bombing. And so in a way, and it may sound funny to say this, in a way, I do not feel all that vulnerable. Yes, the terror, the horror, the whole thing was absolutely awful. But I think I'm perhaps more able to, for want of a better word, understand and appreciate what it is other than Americans who've experienced this, as I say, for the first time. So yes, I feel vulnerable, but perhaps not so much as a natural-born American.
John, thank you. Julie Brown in San Francisco, also on the West Coast. 9/11 was the first time I was actually afraid to live in this country. That's an email from her. I also stopped feeling invincible and realized that anyone could leave you at any moment. It's made me more appreciative of little things and happy just to be alive. Mike Isaac, how much does this tell you about what people have really been through?
I think it tells us quite a lot. To some extent, people become interested in what makes their lives tick each day. So the small details in life, the friendships, the relationships they have, all terribly important, all placed into a very sharp perspective by something like this.
And you understand this business of vulnerability, though?
Very much so. I think one of the whole points of the terrorist action is to induce a feeling of vulnerability in the victims, to amplify that vulnerability way beyond the target. It's the psychological war which is the main war of terrorism, less so than the actual physical war.
Well, Mike, thanks very much, because we can now go as well, I hope. Susan Frederick, can you hear me in New York? We're sitting here in the studio. We've been hearing about vulnerabilities, quite apart from the wind where you are in Ground Zero. You were in the North Tower when the plane hit. How much have you felt vulnerable for the last year?
Well, I was on the 80th floor when the plane hit. I think New Yorkers, as awful as the event was, I think have been prepared in advance for getting out of buildings that have things happen to them. It's not the first time we've walked out of a building that's been on fire, although nothing as dramatic as what happened to us that day. You can't help but feel somewhat vulnerable to those types of events, but quite honestly, we live in a world that's a dangerous world, and you know, you see things in the newspaper every day, so I think that we are prepared in some ways for the fact that every day is a day that you could be at risk, whether it's just walking across the street or leaving your home.
And briefly, Sue, you did say that you felt it was God's hand on that day that saved you.
There's no question that, of course, you come out of there, and if you have any, you know, religious belief, you feel your faith very strongly that day when you survive. I think for me, because I came out 4 minutes in front of the building coming down, there was definitely that impact that, you know, but for the grace of God, go I.
Well, Sue, stand by there, even if you are under quite some threat there from the wind in Ground Zero. Let's now go to California, to Ravi Kiran Vanasai. What's your view of what has happened in the last year?
I think there is a lot of increase in racialism. I'm here in California since 3.5 years, and for the 2.5 years before September 11th was, I would describe it as pretty warm and good, welcoming. But after September 11th, like, I was spitted on once. I had to hear racial slurs many times just because I have brown skin. I am Indian, and India herself is a victim of terrorism for the last 30 years.
So there a claim that things have become more racist. Let's move to Elizabeth Jaffe, who joins us from Chicago. Elizabeth Jaffe, what's your point?
My point is that there's an expression about religious beliefs, as Sue said, and John spoke about vulnerability. My sense of vulnerability and fear came from the fact that my religion does not invoke a deity, and I don't have a God, and while it's good to feel the solidarity that's going on, people helping each other in the wake of disaster, it's immediately followed upon with, and God bless you and God bless America, and that excludes people like me and makes me feel quite marked, because these are wars and arguments between, very often, religions with gods, one people killing another in the name of their God, and that makes me fair game for anyone's bullets.
Mike, what's your view of what you're hearing there about not just vulnerability, but also this almost focus of concern on people?
Yes, I think the key thing when something like this happens is that people form into two groups, the in-group and the out-group. And the out-group are the people that you focus all your anxieties on. The jargon would be that you project your anxieties onto them. In this case, we have people who are Arabs and Muslims. no one is going around pointing at Indonesians, after all, who are the largest Muslim community in the world. It's not specifically a religious thing. The last caller, I think, made an important point, though, about how these are religions that believe in one God rather than many or no gods. I can see how she may feel excluded by that, but I suspect that the expressions of God bless you are not really any more religious than have a nice day is an expression of good
But
fellowship.
Sue Frederick makes clear the importance of God in her and her survival.
Yes, she does. I think that I believe it was one of the former kings of Jordan who said that if my day has come, then nothing can possibly protect me, and if my day has not come, then nothing can possibly harm
Fatalism
me.
in
Fatalism.
That
I think that comes out of many religions.
Thank you. Now let's move to a Palestinian who's actually been in the United Kingdom since 1961. She lives in Belfast. Mrs. Taji.
Hello. Yes, I came to London 1961, but then I went back to Jerusalem. I drove from Jerusalem to Kuwait in 1967. I came to Belfast after that, and I've been living since till today, or God will, for I don't know how. But I feel like I came from the fire. People are telling me that you came from the fire to the fire pan, and I've been suffering for all this my age. And I feel, when I saw, I was out from hospital exactly, and I saw the 9/11, and I was said, oh my goodness, the world went mad. And I felt, oh my goodness, maybe it could be revenge, or because I feel the BBC, they don't ever feel that the Muslim as a Palestinian, and my ancestors were there before Jews and before Christian, before Muslim.
All right.
We used to live all in no harmony. But when you create Israel, the Middle East, you plant a cancer there. And I feel that cancer, it has to be respect for everybody as a human being.
All right, Mrs. Taji, thank you very much for that contribution. I'd like to move on to Hakan Ener from Istanbul in Turkey. What's your point, please?
Hi, I'm actually quite more optimistic than the previous callers because as a young person, I witnessed quite positive improvements in the last 1 year concerning the young people's participation in the intercultural dialogue among nations. And I can support my case with two concrete examples. One is my work with an international youth NGO here in Turkey. We organize intercultural exchange programs among the Turkish and the European youth. And this year has seen a surge in applications. People are so enthusiastic to take part in intercultural dialogue. And the second part is the increased funding for such events. That's quite surprising. After the events of September the 11th, actually we have come across more funding opportunities than ever, than all the previous years, to facilitate such intercultural exchange programs.
All right,
I was invited to New York City.
Hakan Ener, let me go to Sue Frederick, because Sue, after what you went through exactly a year ago, have you generated optimism in your mind and for the future, not least with what's been going on Wall Street behind you?
Oh, absolutely. I think you do come out of this looking towards the future. You absolutely come out considering, you know, what you're supposed to be doing now. What is your life? What is the meaning of your life? And where are you supposed to be going with your life? But I think besides optimism for the future, we came out with a calmness, a new peace that, you know, the small things in life aren't what's important. What's important are friends and family and learning to love one another instead of hating each other. And this is obviously an act of hate and insanity, and you know, we have to figure out how we fix that.
All right, well, this is a very interesting division between optimism and real pessimism here. Mike, let me give you an email from Ziauddin Ahmed, who's in Dhaka in Bangladesh. He said, I feel sad that an evil act by a handful of Islamic fanatics has caused the West to look down upon all Muslims with suspicion. The suspicion will be there for years to come. Are we talking about here about a dreadful event which naturally generates pessimism and deep foreboding? Can one see that optimism coming, as we've seen from Sue?
I think we can certainly see the optimism coming. I think the optimism comes from the manifest solidarity that has been seen in the United States, and here people being solid with people in the United States. I think one potential mistake, though, is to see the September the 11th incident as something that came out of a blue sky and then caused all the problems that, for example, Muslims feel that they are having.
Oh, that's important.
It may have unmasked feelings that are already around.
Well, let me put to you, can we go to Juan Perez, who's in Willimantic, which is in Connecticut in the United States, because that's not your experience, Juan. Tell me what your experience is.
Well, my experience is coming from Puerto Rico, and I'm a person of dark skin. You know, through my whole 17 years that I've been here, I've experienced racism. But after September 11, it's something more obscure. It's your feelings. You can't express yourself without people being at some point even hostile. If you criticize the United States, people get very belligerent, very angry.
Why do people get belligerent and angry in this situation, do you think, Mike?
Well, in my situation, being a...
One moment, Juan. Question to Mike at the moment.
Because they feel insecure. The only way that they can feel secure is if they identify completely with their in-group. Therefore, anyone criticizing the in-group is something that they need to cast aside. So they will be making up for their insecurity by being particularly hostile against people that are apparently against them.
Juan, do you think that's your experience in Connecticut, that this hostility, insecurity?
It probably is. I mean, I'm somebody that I'm an American citizen as Puerto Rican, but yet people do not treat us as American citizens. But then after September 11, people expected me to feel the same pride and fervor that they did, and I didn't feel connected. I didn't feel connected because as a person, student of political science, I know what the United States has done over throughout Latin America and the island of Vieques, Puerto Rico, where people are being bombed and die of cancer. And when you express this, nobody seems to care. So when they express their feeling, and I compare to the suffering in other parts of the world, they, you know, at times, even in my own classroom, people will say, well, you don't get the hell out of this country, you know. You know, they don't, you know, a lot of people do not know about U.S. foreign policy.
All right, Juan Perez, thank you very much indeed. Let's get a few more callers and a couple of emails. From Kaz in New Jersey in the United States. Like many of the bereaved families, I will not allow warmongering to go unprotested. That's how 9/11 has affected me. It has made me appreciate peace even more than before. Let's go on a telephone call to Shamu Varma, who's in New Delhi. I understand you think that really nothing has changed.
Well, frankly, let's look at it from the point of view. The fundamentalists, the terrorists were active before 11 September last year. What has changed? They have been acting every part of the world, particularly in India, including the fact that last night they attacked a train, Rajdhani Express, and over 100 have been killed. So what's so great about talking about September 11 having changed the world? World has not changed. World exactly the same. The only thing is the American perception of the world from 11 September has changed, because they have not had any disaster on them in homeland America. The last disaster the Americans had was in Honolulu during 7th December 1941.
All right, Shamu, thank you very much indeed. Donald Steckman, who's in Simonstown in South Africa. What's your view about what has changed?
Well, no, I don't think much has changed in South Africa, possibly because we're about 11,000 kilometers away and people think they're isolated here.
Does that mean really South Africa never really felt the shock?
I don't think people were, you know, were that sort of bothered about it, apart from when they're, I mean, now we have to, I don't travel much by air myself, but the few people who do travel by air in this country, the minority, they have to spend longer in the check-ins and things like this. The price of petrol, because of the oil, the price has gone up. That's affected people. But then we've had the World Sustainable Development Summit, and the American representative was jeered and heckled. That's about as far as it goes.
Well, let me turn to Sue Frederick again at Ground Zero in Manhattan. Sue, when you listen, I hope you were able to hear him, Shamu Varma from New Delhi, saying that really he doesn't think much has changed. Do you think the American perception of what's going on in the world has changed?
It's a very interesting question, because America is a real mix of people to start with, a mix of cultures. In our company, we work with people from all around the world. And I think that there are some people here in America who have a very global perspective and understand the world as it exists today. And there are others who, may choose to be a little bit more isolated about global events. But we are a global world today. You can't do business in isolation. So I can understand where that person's perspective is coming from. But I know that the people that I speak with daily have a world view, not a singular U.S. view.
Well, let's take very much a world view here, because are we getting our relative values right? Here we have Diana Pencic, who has emailed us from Belgrade in Yugoslavia, who has written, "I'm very annoyed that every time I turn on the TV, I have to hear about September the 11th. Have you forgotten that we were also bombed?" That's reference to the war over Kosovo with NATO. "Our children are no less important than American children." Khalid Butt in Karachi in Pakistan, what's your point on that?
I think September 11 has increased hatred, and Americans now cannot walk on the roads of many countries. Seeing soldiers on the airports in the United States of America is something very different.
What about, though, what about something like Kashmir? The fact that, after all, there's a large amount of death in Kashmir at the moment.
Yes, and the Kashmir and the injustice is big. For example, in Kashmir, what's going on in Kashmir or Palestine, and at the same time the sanctions on Iraq, Iran, Libya, and unless we, do something about the justice, it is not important. The American lives are as important as Kashmiri lives.
Well, this is another point made by Zahida Feki from South Africa, who writes in an email, during the Rwandan massacres, the international community didn't react with such deep mourning or exact the same retribution seen following 9/11. Many of us feel that all lives are equal, but American lives seem more equal than others. We're getting a lot of anger about this reflected. Mike, what's your feeling about this? People saying, hang on, America thinks it is the only problem in the world.
I think that believing that all lives are equal and reacting to the 9/11 story in America are two completely different things. I don't think people are saying, oh gosh, 3,000 Americans are killed, that is far worse than 6,000 in another country or anything like that. I do not think that that kind of...
Or up to 1 million in Rwanda.
Whatever it is. I think that the point about the 9/11 was how it occurred in such an unexpected way all at once. If people were really talking about purely in terms of numbers, they would be far more up in arms about people killed in road accidents, for example. The point is that people killed in road accidents happen throughout the year. This happened in a matter of hours.
So it's shock, is it?
It's shock. It's the shock and the context of what happened that was so awful about this.
All right, well,
it's not a matter of numbers.
Let me move on with an email from Mai Alani in Syria. We all feel sorry for the victims of 9/11, but on the other hand, no one felt sorry for what happened in Palestine. What makes the victims of 9/11 human beings and Palestinian people worthy of rights no better than those given to animals? Charles White in Perth in Australia, your concern is this moral equivalency.
Yes, exactly. How do we draw a moral equivalency between Israeli government trying to protect its citizens and the direct targeting of innocent civilians who, who have probably don't know exactly what's going on in the other side of the world? Exactly how do we confront that without encountering some sort of hatred? Especially when you consider some people, most of the Muslims around the world draw some sort of attachment to the Palestinians without even actually being Palestinians or having members of family who are in Palestine. They only use their religion to draw it. There is some sort of hatred that can't be discarded over there. I just don't know what to do with that.
All right. We've got a text message from Malik in India. 9/11 was not just an attack on the World Trade Center, but on all humanity. All humans should fight against terrorism, irrespective of nationality, caste, or religion. This issue of moral equivalency, you're a psychiatrist. When you judge 3,000 against maybe almost 1 million in Rwanda and what's happened, we've had a number of points there about the Palestinians, for example. Are we getting our morality wrong?
Stalin used to say that one death was a tragedy, but a million was a statistic. I think that there are some numbers which for us are unmanageable. And so it's very difficult for us psychologically to feel the pain of 100,000 or 1 million deaths in the same way that we can feel the deaths of 2,000 or 3,000 people with whom we ourselves identify very closely because they are people very similar to us. That is part of human nature. People who are able to take a completely equal view are very few and far between.
What about the very human reaction? Oru Okali Uke from Douala in Cameroon saying the whole of our family wept over the attack in the United States, and I myself didn't eat for 3 days because it pains me a lot. In our town, there was a great distress, very different from that South African reaction. In other words, deep in the heart.
Yes, yes, and I think that was probably the more common response that would have been found, certainly in Europe and probably in other parts of the world.
Well, Dr. Mike Isaac, thanks for joining us here, and also to Sue Frederick, who survived the blowing in Ground Zero. We'll be back at 18:30 GMT to discuss America's place in the world. Do keep those calls and text messages and emails coming through. Till then, bye-bye.